All right. So like I said, we'll try to run through this very quickly and see what exactly is a function. So a few things that we'll talk about that we need to achieve before the end of this class. We'll talk about the basics of what functions are. We'll also talk about, oops, I keep moving that. We'll also talk about built-in versus user-defined functions. We'll talk about what it means to define a function or call a function. We'll actually do all of those as well, and differentiate between parameters and arguments. Those are really very easy to confuse. And finally, we'll talk about void and fruitful functions. Fruitful functions just return stuff. Void functions don't return anything. So all in all, you should be in a better place to understand how all of this works together. So big picture again, we'll be able to learn how to define and call functions, and then we'll also learn how to use functions with various types of return values. So functions are very important because it makes our code modular. That means you can take your code and turn it into a module. So just like we said on our first day, how we broke down variable statements and then getting to functions and modules, where you actually have a compact piece of code that can be reused, a module that can be imported, and so on and so forth. All right. So let's dive right in now. What are the basics of functions? So as you can see in the diagram right here, the function is pretty much more or less like a black box, right? It accepts an input and gives you an output. Okay, so you put something into a function and it spits something else out. Again, not all functions take inputs. Some functions do not take any inputs, they just execute and give you an output. For instance, a function to get today's date will not need to take an input, it's just going to give you an output. Other cases, functions take inputs and they don't have an output. That output, like we said just recently, is a return value. Okay, so it depends on how you want to use your function. And again, you might have one or two inputs, you might have one or more outputs. It all depends. It gets, very, very versatile when you look at it in place. But in real English, a function is just a group of statements. Anything that you know that you do repeatedly, you can group the tasks together to become a function. For instance, if you know that every morning I'll have to give instructions to the kids or give instructions to someone and say, hey, get up, make up your bed, brush your teeth, shower, make breakfast, clean the dishes, eat your food, and then go to work. If you do that every day, you can, rather than just repeat those statements or those instructions, you can have one instruction that encompasses all of that. Get ready for work means do all of those instructions or do all of those steps. And if you decide to start having an input in there, you can decide to be more specific and say, Adolf, get ready for work. Aaron, get ready for work. In that case, you're passing in Adolf and Aaron in there, so they're going to do it differently. All right. And you can also make sure that you have a return value, which we'll talk about in short. So that's in a big picture of what a function is. Does that make sense to everybody? So rather than having to have those steps each time, for instance, the print function is a series of steps. It could be one or two or three statements put together, but just grouping them makes it easier. Why do we need to do that? Okay, there are many benefits, as you can see. It makes your code simpler. Okay. Also, you're able to reuse your code. You don't have to repeat it each time. Last week, we had to repeat some codes in a few places, but once we start working with functions, all you have to do is define your function and then call it when you need it, and then that's it. So one thing that we'll not cover too much in our class, in our program, or in this program, of course, is testing. But testing is very important. It's imperative for you to test your code before you ship it out. Okay. But with functions, it's easier for you to test it because functions are expected to do one thing and one thing only. That's why they call them modules. So you want your function to have what is known as SRP, single responsibility principle. If your function does more than one thing, break it into separate functions. We'll talk about those as well. But it makes your development faster. So if each person is working on one function, you already have a function. No need to recreate the wheel or reinvent the wheel. You can go ahead and just use that function that has already been created. For instance, we have never had to write a code that should explain how the printing process works. But we know that if we use print, it also just executes and spits out what we put in there as the input on the console. If we use type, it tells us what type of data we entered in the parameter. If we use input, it is able to get our input and then do whatever computation we need with that. So it makes our development faster and also facilitates teamwork, because when you know that you're supposed to build this wonderful application or software, you can tell this team to work on this function and that team to work on that function. Each team works on separate functions, and then you can now merge it into one piece of application or one piece of software to be able to ship it out. So each piece of each team works independently, but then you can merge it all together. Sounds good? So think of a big picture there. If your team is working on a particular function, all they have to do is define that function, save it in a file, put it in a folder. Another team works on their own file, put it in that folder. All those separate files are in one folder. That becomes a package. So that package has several modules in there. The modules are each of those files, and then you can package them together to ship it out as a library. Okay. So that's in a nutshell what a function is. So let's take a look then at some examples. Okay, because there can be two types of functions in Python and in most programming languages, in short. Okay, you have built-in functions. These are functions that are included in Python. Right? So when you install Python, CPython, or whichever particular distribution of Python, it comes with a set of functions already in there Those functions help us solve common problems. For instance, abs would give you the absolute value of any number that you enter in there. Okay, bool will tell you whatever the value is. str, where is it? Right here, is going to give you the string representation of that value, and so on and so forth. Max would give you the maximum in that value. So you can convert a number to a float by using the float, and so on and so forth. Length, len, which is short for the length of anything, gives you the number of records in a particular set, and so on and so forth. So those are built-in functions in Python that you can use whenever you need them. You don't need to recreate them. But that's not all that we can do with Python. We can decide to define our own functions, to create our own functions. If we have to create a function, there's a particular syntax for that. Okay, as you see right here on the right, you can define your function by starting with the def keyword, which obviously means define, right? And once you use that keyword, you have to give a name of your function. So imagine that you have multiple instructions that you have to be executed. You have to give those set of instructions a particular name. When you say that name, that's what you're referring to. Also, remember, just like our variables in the past that we talked about, those function names per se have particular rules. You cannot start it with a number. You know, it's case sensitive, so you have to be careful how you're using the function names. And you want to make sure that it doesn't start with special characters and so on. So all those different naming rules. You cannot use a keyword to be the name of a function. And you want to be very careful, because it's very discouraged to use the same name for a function as the name of a variable. So let your functions have some mnemonic names that mean something. You know, most of the time, it's advisable to have your function to have some kind of a verb in it, what it does. Okay. So again, having function 1, function 2, function 3 will not really be helpful. All right. So give your function a name. And after that, you have parentheses and a column. The parentheses are used to hold your parameters, which we'll talk about shortly. The parentheses holds your parameters, and then all of that line, that first line, is known as the header of the function. Just like we talked about earlier when we looked at if statements. And we said the if statement was a compound statement. Just like the if statement, the definition of a function is a compound statement. So when we end with a colon, we go on to the body of the function. The body of this function now has multiple instructions in there. It could be one, it could be many, and so on and so forth, depending on what you want to do. And you want to make sure that the body is indented. And if the function is having an output, if it has a return value, then you want to end with that return value out there. Okay. So make sure your block of statements are indented. After that, you're done. So it's as easy as that. Very simple to create a function that does anything. But you have to take note. Creating a function is like defining that function. It uses a compound statement. But that's all you're doing. You just created a function. In order for you to use it, in order for you to execute it, you have to call that function. To call the function, you have to use a statement. So we've been calling the print function. We've been calling the str or stir function for string. We've also been calling the input function to be able to enter user input. So all those are ways that we can execute a function. What questions do you have so far? Any questions for me? Yes, go for it.
The return within the function. Can you provide some context, because I've struggled a bit with that, and it looks like the knowledge I have right now is kind of random.
Excellent, excellent. So that's something that I wanted to take time to talk about it after our break. But let me give you an idea on that. What I mean, let's